Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little colder and closer to the town's edge than our usual tales. The lives of medieval executioners, those who carried out sentences yet were kept at arm's length by the world they served. Forget the Hollywood versions. These were not cloaked avengers or celebrated civic figures, but people bound to a grim trade and to the rumours, superstitions, and scorn of their neighbours. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a day wearing their shoes. Shunned from tables, barred from churches, forced to live on the margins where even kindness came with a price. Take a second to like and subscribe if this is the kind of content you enjoy, and in the comments, share your location and the time where you are. I love seeing how far and wide our community reaches. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. When a medieval lord or a medieval king spoke of the law, they often meant a power that reached not merely into words on parchment but into bodies in the street. That power had to have a hand, and that hand needed a person to close and open it. The office of the executioner grew up, not as a poetic anomaly, but as a practical answer to a legal and administrative problem that medieval polities faced when they learned to make punishments systematic. Across Europe, the late 11th through the 15th centuries saw a steady hardening of criminal procedure. Charters, royal writs, municipal ordinances and seigneurial customs all assigned the unpleasant business of final enforcement to particular officers. The phenomenon is easiest to trace by watching where the right to punish concentrated. The king's court, the seigneur's manor, the urban council chamber. Where the right of high justice, in Latin the ius gladii, the right of the sword, or in French la haute justice, was exercised. Someone had to exercise its deadly edge. That someone was the executioner, variously called the bourreau in France, the henker in the German lands, the verdugo in Spain, and in England the hangman or headsman, and the office was enshrined in law, charter and custom. It helps to fix a few dates. In England, the Assize of Clarendon, 6, and later the itinerant justices of Henry VII's reforms created a stronger royal apparatus of criminal justice that required reliable practical hands to carry out sentences across shires. By the 13th century, the Magna Carta, 1215, and subsequent statutes had, for better and worse, more clearly defined what punishments might follow what crimes. Local sheriffs and the king's justices needed executioners to perform their sentences. On the continent, canon law and secular statutes worked alongside each other. Gratian's Decretum, compiled in the middle of the 12th century, helped shape the division between ecclesiastical jurisdiction, where clergy dispensed penance and spiritual remedies, and secular jurisdiction, where corporal and capital reprisals were administered. The papal measures of the 13th century, most visibly the formalisation of inquisitorial processes under Gregory IX in the 1230s, made this division plain. Ecclesiastical courts would find offenders guilty of heresy but would not themselves shed blood. They would hand the condemned over to the secular arm to be punished by the hangman, the headsman, or the pie attender. That fiscal and juridical division created an administrative demand, a roster of men who were legally empowered to do what the clergy and polite citizens would not. Different localities solved that administrative demand in different ways. In many towns, the executioner became a municipal official, hired, paid, and protected by the commune. In London, the sheriff oversaw capital sentences and the hangman acted at his direction. Tyburn developed as a place for public executions as early as the later 12th century, and remained the city's chosen theatre for capital punishment for centuries. In Paris, the Place de Grève served for a long time as the urban execution place, where the bourreau performed duties openly on orders from the prévôt, or later the municipal authorities. In the patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire, numerous free imperial cities such as Nuremberg and Cologne recorded in their city ordinances and council minutes the rights and obligations of the henker, who was often given a house near the walls, an official coat, a specified wage or fee, and a list of services he must render. In rural France and England, the seigneurial courts exercised la haute justice for offences committed on the lord's domain. The lord might employ or authorise an executioner to apply his judgment. The administrative necessity cut across the variety of polities, whether royal, municipal or manorial. Legal systems delegated the active work of punishment to named persons, and, in doing so, made that work an office. These legal instruments both authorised the executioner and insulated him from ordinary civic obligations, and in that double movement lay the seed of stigma. He was protected when he performed the law, Statutes and charters commonly stipulated that no one should molest an official carrying out a lawful sentence. The executioner could not lawfully be assaulted with impunity while acting under writ. In some places his person was inviolable in a formal sense because he executed the sovereign's peace. But the same documents often kept him at arm's length from ordinary civic life. Guild rules, marriage registers, burial rolls, and municipal custom records show again and again a pattern. The executioner had privileges that shielded him in his duty and restrictions that isolated him in his life. He might be exempted from certain taxes or allowed a monopoly on the less pleasant trades the community would not otherwise perform. In turn, he was frequently denied membership in guild halls, shunned in markets, and required to live at the city margin. Many towns took to making the office transmissible, effectively hereditary. A family would hold the role over generations. Records survive in which a civic council, confronted with the difficulty of finding a man willing permanently to bear the office's disgrace, simply decided to bind the work to a house and a surname. What the legal framework did, in short, was to create simultaneously an indispensable public servant and a designated social outsider. The executioner's daily work was an ordinary kind of extraordinary routine, a convergence of craft, logistics, ceremony, and the mechanical repetition of unpleasant tasks. From dawn on the day of a sentence, the officer's business was not rhetorical but mechanical. He received the writ and checked the names, a warrant authenticated by the mayor, the sheriff or the seigneur. He consulted the jailer, examined the prisoner's irons, and made sure the transport from the prison to the scaffold was practicable. He measured rope, he checked the axe, he repaired the wheel, he ordered fresh planking for the scaffold. He coordinated with the cleric who would offer the last rites, and with the town crier who would call the populace to witness what the magistrate had ordained. There was a ritual choreography to get right. The execution had to be public enough to be didactic, but organised enough to keep commerce moving. The scaffold had to be safe. The wheel had to turn, the noose must be the right knot for the intended sentence. It was less a blood sport than a municipal operation that required competence, timeliness, and perversely discretion. The tools themselves were objects of craft and routine maintenance rather than instruments of whim. The axe head needed to be tempered by a smith who understood the brief, to remove a head cleanly, to do the job expected without excess time and without failing so miserably that civic reproach or a fine followed. The rope had to be woven of the right fibres and cut to the measure that the local custom or legal preferment demanded. Ropes were sometimes branded, kept in municipal stores, and inspected as part of the preparation. The wheel was a carpenter's feat. Spokes, axle, and binding had to be strong enough to resist the weight they were meant to break and predictable enough to avoid genuine catastrophe. The rack and other devices of torture, when required by court order, had to be engineered with the subtlety of a physician's ingenuity, careful enough to elicit confession, yet calibrated not to kill the subject unless the judge had decided otherwise. Executioners learned how far they might go. They became, in effect, technicians of pain whose job was to get the mechanics right. That skill made them necessary. It also made them socially odious. There was also a bookkeeping side to the job. Executioners were paid often in fees per sentence rather than in an annual wage, and those fees had to be accounted for in the municipal rolls. Sheriff's accounts from English boroughs, Parisian municipal registries, and German Ratscheren ledgers show payments to men identified as the city executioner. Fees for the execution itself, sums for maintaining the scaffold, disbursements for rope and coal. When the job granted the right to sell the clothing of the condemned, or to receive the skin of a horse, or the carcass of a beast too dangerous for ordinary butchers, those profits were entered in local account books. The office was part wage and part market venture. This fiscal aspect made the executioner less a grotesque anomaly and more an economic functionary. The urban community purchased his services because the community knew the cost of disorder was often higher than the price of making the penalty visible and enforceable. The public sentence itself was a tightly managed ceremony where law, religion, and theatre converged. A procession rarely moved without purpose. The condemned were frequently led in a route that passed the principal public places, the churches, and the market, a route that ensured the punishment reinforced civic pedagogy. At the scaffold, the executioner performed an unmistakable role. He was at the hinge between the judge's authority and the physical end of an offender's life. A priest read and administered sacraments where applicable. A civil officer read the writ and the reasons for the sentence, and the executioner did what the court had ordered. Sometimes the executioner's work followed a precise liturgy. In inquisitorial cases, for example, ecclesiastical courts would pronounce spiritual penalties and then hand the culpable person over to the secular hand with the famous formula, in many records a formal, "We deliver the condemned to the secular arm," which meant the executioner would now be responsible for the worldly part of the sentence. There was, in that moment, an economy of absolution and violence that the executioner inhabited as a worker's necessary role. He was the secular arm incarnate. A civilian who specialised in these tasks often carried other municipal burdens. Towns instructed their hamlets and their corporations in their early modern sense to keep certain unsavoury responsibilities in one hand. Scavenging, the removal of dead animals from the streets, the disposal of human refuse, the butchering of animals beyond the capacity of respectable guilds, was commonly assigned to those whose legal and social status already kept them at a remove. That is how executioners' occupations and unclean trades overlapped. To be allowed to carry out the aims of the law, the executioner was often given things no one else wanted. Tanning, skinning, and other jobs involving blood and dead flesh were relegated to the periphery and sometimes granted as monopolies to the executioner, because other townsfolk would not sully their hands. In many cities, tanneries and slaughterhouses were placed outside the walls precisely to protect the interior from smells and sight. Executioners' houses, when permitted goings inside at all, sat at a margin. The pattern was not uniform, but it was common enough to become almost a trope of late medieval urban geography. The practical rituals of disposal further entrenched the social isolation. The body of an executed person was seldom treated the same way as a quiet parishioner who died in bed. Burial inside consecrated churchyards was often denied to those executed for serious crimes. Instead, their corpses might be buried in unconsecrated ground or hurriedly interred beyond a boundary marker, or, in cases where the city desired to make a spectacle of deterrence, exhibited on a gibbet until the elements and scavengers took what they would. The head of a condemned traitor might be mounted on a pike and exhibited on a bridge. London Bridge in England became notorious in later centuries for the practice, but earlier precedents are visible in city gates and walls throughout medieval Europe, so that merchants, tellers, and peasants coming in from the road would see the consequences of treason. The executioner's duties therefore extended beyond the moment of death to the display and disposal of remains, and those tasks kept his hands in contact with the most societally repulsive residues of punishment. There were, beneath the bureaucratic and technical competence, moral and theological reasons for that distance. Medieval Christianity taught that the body mattered. The doctrine of the resurrection of the body made proper burial a spiritual as well as communal matter. The corpse was expected to be treated with a certain respect because it would one day rise. Canon law and the liturgical books prescribed care for the dead that could not easily be squared with the handling of an executed criminal whose burial was denied. Moreover, clerics needed a kind of ritual purity to celebrate the sacraments. They were set apart by rules and customs that made contact with the dead problematic for their liturgical functions. The decretals and collections like Gradian's work compiled a body of norms that kept clergy from taking up violent, blood-stained tasks. Stated baldly, the Church preferred to admonish rather than to slay. When it did pronounce severe penalties, it tended to parcel out the material execution of the sentence to the secular authorities. The Church could and did declare heresy and penance. It did not itself swing the sword, and in many texts we find an explicit language to the effect that the Church abhors the shedding of blood and will not itself perform it. Hence the secular arm, and hence the executioner. Because clergy rarely performed executions, and because ecclesiastical rites were sometimes withheld from the hanged and the beheaded, the executioner acquired a religiously coded status. He was, in a popular imagination shaped by sermons and miracle tales, the mediator of a necessary, even sacramental-looking function that the Church itself would not touch. The men who bound, who cut, who burned, who compelled the rack to creak, stepped between the sacred and the profane. They handled blood, they handled corpses, they did what the parish priest could not do if he wished to retain the full respectability of his altar. By virtue of these acts, communities developed an anxiety about touching and contact. Popular notions of pollution, drawn in part from older Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultural templates, and in part from the residue of canonistic thought, meant that anyone who repeatedly handled dead or blood-soaked matter might be seen as ritually contaminated in a way that required social avoidance. The intersection of ecclesiastical law and popular custom produced curious local practices. In some towns, executioners and their families were allowed to receive sacraments and to enter churches, but they were assigned particular spaces or times, segregated out of deference to the anxieties of their neighbours. In other places, the executioner lived at the edge of town and was baptised and buried there. His family's names appear in parish registers like a different kind of margin. There are records in municipal statutes, in church court depositions, in notarial acts, showing, for instance, orders that executioners keep their animals beyond the gate, or that their wives and daughters refrain from joining the linenworker guilds. These are small municipal violences of exclusion, quotidian and bureaucratic, and they add up. The executioner's children might be nicknamed in the market, his neighbour might withhold a handshake. His wife might not be permitted to sell wool in the proper place. That social material sealed the isolation the formal law had begun. Of course, the picture is not monolithic. There were practical variations and exceptions. Some executioners were respected for their skill and for the equanimity with which they performed their necessary function. In times of plague or civic emergency, a competent henker was an asset whose practical benefits could outweigh squeamishness. Some families holding the office for generations accrued enough tacit acceptance to trade with their neighbours and to raise sons who became artisans in their own right. Yet the structures that produced the role, the split between ecclesiastical and secular authority, the necessity that someone perform acts the church would not, the urban need for a person to be both guarantor and demonstration of the law made stigma hard to avoid. The ritual and the craft that defined the daily work also defined the taboo. There were philosophical and rhetorical reasons, too, why a city wants an executioner at a respectable distance. The executioner's marginality made him a kind of externalization of the community's violence. The town could condemn through law and then look at the instrument of its own judgment as if the action had been performed by another. This psychological operation, to see punishment as a calculated civic necessity, but the agent as an expendable other, has a long history and is visible in medieval records where civic councils discuss how to distance the office, how to authorise it, how to make it both effective and as little integrated into polite society as possible. The executioner embodied a paradox. He was central to the maintenance of order and deliberately peripheral to the social fabric. Religious reasoning reinforced that paradox. The clerical separation from the physical instruments of punishment created, in the popular mind, a sacred-profane split. Clergy were often the last to stand by the condemned and the first to say prayers for the soul, yet they did not wield the axe. The common expression of medieval piety emphasised that the soul mattered more than the body, and so the sacramental concerns of confession and absolution were reserved for those who could be brought back into the fold. The executioner, in contrast, was a man of the body and the pavement. People wanted their sins and the sins of the condemned to be washed away by confession and the sacraments. They wanted the sacred to be intact. Keeping a symbolic hand between altar and gallows comforted them. It is a small irony that the same church that declared the body's sanctity outsourced the physical guarding of that sanctity to men who handled bodily effluvia and corpses. This logic finds concrete expression in the ways medieval communities took responsibility for ritual and hygienic order. Practices around who could enter the church, who could be buried in consecrated ground, and who might attend the sacrament of the Eucharist were policed not only by canon lawyers but by lay custom. Parish priests worked under social pressure. They had to keep the peace as much as the penitential register. If parishioners expected the executioner's family to be kept at arm's length, the priest had few resources to resist without risking scandal or complaint. In some locales this led to official lines drawn in the sand, busto, the executioner's house by the ditch, the tanner's yard at the river bend, and in others to informal understandings that became hard constraints. A medieval mind that had to imagine an ordered world would find comfort in mapped boundaries. The holy precinct, the marketplace, the executioner's house. Each location had its function and its rules. The executioner's house, inevitably placed where the town's map permitted least contamination, became itself a symbol. And yet one must not imagine medieval ostracism as a modern form of absolute exclusion. Executioners did not vanish into the river. They ate, slept, married, baptised children and bore griefs. There are parish registers with the handwriting of a priest recording the baptism of an executioner's child. Municipal accounts show that executioners sometimes sued their employers for unpaid wages. There are notarial deeds in which an executioner bought and sold a plot of land beyond the gate. The human detail recurs. The man who knelt for the sacrament could also be the one who tightened the rope. The society's ambivalence was practical and theological, not demonic. Indeed, many a town and lordship relied on their executioners to be predictable and even merciful in a narrowly legal sense, to perform a sentence in a manner that minimised gratuitous suffering and assured the credibility of the law. Mercy, after all, was a formalisable virtue in many legal codes. The law could demand that executions be done cleanly, not theatrically brutal, because botched justice undermined authority. The medieval executioner therefore lived at an intersection of law, craft and religion. Law supplied the commission and the protection. Craft supplied the competence and the tools. Religion supplied the reason the community would not perform such tasks itself. Over time, these elements reinforced each other. Legal appointment made the work official. Practical tasks produced habits of marginal labour. Theological anxieties about blood and corpse created social boundaries that turned occupational necessity into familial stigma. The combined effect sat in the city's bones. Marketplaces, guild halls, altars and civic councils agreed, explicitly or implicitly, on the logic that someone must be the executioner, and on the logic that such a person should remain, as much as possible, an avoidable presence. If you imagine yourself walking through a medieval town on an autumn morning, you could tell where those social edges were drawn. You would find the smell of tanneries on the wind at the city's back, the cart tracks flaring toward the ditch where the executioner's house might crouch like an old thing at the edge of a well. You would see the scaffold set out in the market square on a particular day, but most days the executions were the administration of routine. Rope kept neat in a municipal chest, an axe sharpened to specification in the smith shop, a ledger with names and fees in a civic office. The executioner was, in this sense, more a civic artisan than a theatrical monster. He was paid because the community needed predictability, and he was shunned because the community needed distance. That double law, efficiency and exclusion, is what made him a social outcast in the medieval world. There is, in the end, a quiet moral note to be plucked from this history. The medieval executioner's life was made of administrative certainties and social ambiguities, appointed by law, sustained by the municipal accounting, trained in a craft that required steady hands and a steely temperament, and surrounded by rites that declared him both necessary and unclean. The legal frameworks he served praised the law's order and formally empowered his hand. The same frameworks laid the architecture of his isolation. The ritual of public punishment required a specialist. The liturgy of the church eschewed the specialist's work. Popular custom turned the man who did what needed doing into a figure to be watched from a distance. In the hush that falls between the toll of the bell and the close of the market, one can hear all those forces at work, the city's appetite for order, and its need to keep the instruments of that order at bay. It is a strange secular liturgy, slow and precise, and the man who enacted it was both official and other, necessary and excluded, a person whose very existence made the medieval polity's claims about justice both possible and morally complicated. In the written law of medieval Europe, the executioner rarely appears as a mere footnote of gossip. He appears instead as a marked legal person, a category carved into charters and codes with the same deliberate hand that men used to carve a city's walls. The jurisprudence of the age did not simply record prejudice, it authorized it. From the 12th century onward, the language of canonists and municipal lawmakers, Gratian's Decretum sitting in the middle of the 12th century as a pivot, gave shape to a legal notion that lawyers called infamia. Infamia meant more than shame. It meant disability, an inability to swear a binding oath, to serve on a jury, to hold corporate office or bear certain civic honours. It translated a social judgment into enforceable exclusions, and executioners, because of what they did and because of what their work signified, were often folded into this juridical category. The conceptual scaffolding that made an executioner legally suspect came from two directions at once. One was the Roman canonical inheritance that medieval jurists carried with them, an inheritance that treated some occupations as morally suspect and therefore legally inept. The other was the pragmatic municipal world of cities and towns, where rulers needed hands to apply sentences, and yet could not permit those hands to sit on councils or give sworn testimony in the courts that dispatched the condemned. So the solution was to write the problem into law. The town that demanded a head also drew a line in its statutes declaring who could not hold a head. You can see the pattern in the records of very different polities. In the communes of northern Italy, where statutes were carefully compiled, Bologna, Siena, Florence, the idea of honestia determined who could swear or stand for office. The municipal rolls are full of exclusions that read, in effect, "A man of dishonest trade cannot be admitted." Executioners are rarely named with gentle titles there. They carry the bluntness of the vernacular, boya, and they carry, often explicitly, the status of ineligibility. In the imperial free cities of the German lands, under various iterations of Magdeburg and Lübeck law and their local Stadtrechte, the Scharfrichter was an indispensable functionary who was nonetheless kept at a remove in terms of civic rights. He was employed, regulated, sometimes provided for, but he was barred from the honours and duties that conferred recognition. No guild seats, no municipal councils, no juror's oath. In the kingdoms of England and France, the pattern echoed with national inflections. England's medieval courts relied heavily on oath and reputation. The man who could not be sworn simply could not be used as ordinary evidence. The king's hangman was a public officer in the sense of being hired to do a task, but many boroughs' customs and records show that such men were not counted among the trustworthy. The hangman's presence at the gallows made him an agent of governmental power in one register and an untrustworthy social being in another. The paradox is visible in London. The place of execution, Tyburn, remained outside the city for centuries, where the authorities could stage the spectacle of sovereignty without having the instrument of death assume the ordinary rights of civic membership. Tyburn's long tenure as the site of London's public hangings, stretching until the late 18th century, is a geographical reminder that law and ritual agreed on one solution: push the performance of death to the periphery and keep the performers at the margin. As the legal machinery of the towns matured, so too did the catalogue of civil disabilities attached to the executioner. Some are bluntly administrative. He could not be a juror, he could not serve on the city council, he could not be a bell-ringing member of the parish guild, he could not be entrusted with guardianship over orphans or hold offices connected to the administration of justice. The legal logic was nearly airtight. Oaths and offices required a public reputation for trust. The office of the executioner, by its very purpose, branded its holder with ambiguity, necessary, useful, and yet unclean in a moral sense. And so lawmakers had to name it formally as a disqualification. When disputes arose, if an executioner pressed claim to a civic right, his opponents pointed in hard ink to the municipal ordinances or to canonical precedents and shut the door. Other disabilities were fashioned with an almost surgical cruelty. In many places, the law forbade the executioner, and sometimes his family, from being buried within consecrated ground. Churchyard burial meant more than a grave. It was an inclusion in a community's sacral geography. To deny such burial was to commit a legal and spiritual exile. The medieval imagination linked bodily contact with the dead to ritual impurity, and the law could designate certain people as perpetually unclean in that way. Where ecclesiastical authorities wielded power, their officials could insist on burial exclusion as a punishment distinct from secular fines. Parish records in some dioceses show long negotiations. Payments and petitions were made on behalf of the executioners seeking a Christian burial. Petitions that might be granted only after an expiation of sorts, a sum paid, a vigil observed, a mass granted in return for admission into consecrated earth. For the average town, though, the easier course was to legislate separation. No civic office, no sworn oath, no grave within the parish bounds. A society that tied legal credibilities to social honour also found it necessary to limit the executioner's ability to act as a witness. Medieval courts trusted sworn speech. They distrusted men the law had already labelled infamous. The gap between being able to attest under oath and being refused that trust was a wound in the legal personhood of the executioner. Imagine for a moment the consequences of such an arrangement when the executioner's knowledge was sometimes uniquely valuable. He knew the private habits of condemned men brought to the gallows. He had seen the routes by which information and hidden goods passed. Yet in many jurisdictions he is explicitly described as unoathable. The law thus transformed local fear and moral discomfort into a rule that made his testimony, if usable at all, second class, either admissible only as unsworn hearsay or simply ignored. The effect is predictable and profound. Deny someone the authority of the oath, and you stop him from participating in the system that organises property, reputation, and justice. Sometimes the statutes went further. In many municipal codes, the offspring of an executioner bore a stigma that restricted their opportunities. A son of the hangman might find it impossible to be admitted as an apprentice in a prestigious craft. Guild ordinances often stated, sometimes in the florid language of piety, and sometimes in the blunt terms of commerce, that the fellowship would not admit dishonest persons or those with stained repute. The immediate effect is economic. Access to apprenticeship, networks of credit, and marriage prospects is shorn away. The longer-term effect is social. The executioner becomes the head of a family whose legal status is heritable in practice, if not always in law. Historians of early modern Europe have noted this pattern again and again. In the late medieval period, it was forming in towns across the continent. In this sense, the law did not merely punish the man who wielded the axe or rope, it legislated the prospects of his children. If this all sounds like a paradox stitched into parchment, because it is, the paradox is instructive. Rulers and magistrates had incentives to make the executioner depend upon them. A man who depended on municipal pay, on the right to sell certain things, on tax exemptions granted by the town's council, was less likely to be independent, less likely to set himself up as a rival authority. So alongside the prohibitions, the law sometimes provided compensations, written down in grants and letters. The Bourreau of Paris in later centuries would hold letters of office, receive a salary, and even be guaranteed a place to live. The Sanson family, who served as executioners in Paris from the late 17th century into the 19th, illustrate this contract nicely. The family was tied legally to the crown and to the city in a way that both protected them and codified their exclusion. The king needed them, the king would pay them, but the king would not give them honour. That is the legal compact, protection without inclusion, provision without membership. The effect of all these statutes and ordinances on everyday experience is not abstract. Law worked in the body and in the city's form, and so where the law said remove, the city built its removal into streets and into the rhythm of movement. Space and statute conspired. The geography of marginalisation in medieval cities is not exotic. It is practical and pungent. The place of execution had to be visible, and it had to be outside the fragile heart of commerce, the market, the guildhall, the parish church. For that reason the gallows often stood on hills, on roadsides, at crossroads. The German name Galgenberg, Gallows Hill, is almost a topographical refrain across the Rhineland and beyond. To travel to the gallows was to be taken out of the city's civic choreography and set along a path where the community displayed its power. The gallows would be sited where the maximum number of passers-by could see it, where a highway met a town gate, where shepherds and merchants and villagers would cross. That same logic applied to where the hangman lived. There is a distinct toponymy to these choices. Houses of the executioner cluster at gates and margins, often near tanneries and slaughterhouses. The smell was no accident. The association between the executioner and trades that touched on carcasses, tanning, butchery was a practical compatibility. These were trades that other townsmen also disfavoured, and which municipal planners often preferred to keep outside the ring of parishes and chambers. It is worth tracing a few pictures. Picture London. Tyburn, a clearing outside the city's western approaches, for centuries the place where the condemned assembled and the hangman performed his grim duty. When crowds came, they came from the city and from the roads that led into it. They watched from the margins, they laughed and cried and bartered and made bets. The hangman needed to be able to reach the gallows, but he did not belong in the market. He lived near the outer roads or in quarters that were less desirable, in lodgings that faced the fields rather than church steeples. In Paris, the spatial story bends differently at points. The Place de Grève was, for a long period, a central square on the right bank where public executions took place. The borough's connection to the public square made him highly visible in one sense and yet socially excluded in another. Cities did not always follow a single pattern. Some put the executioner in the heart for the spectacle of law, others pushed him out to preserve the sanctity and markets of the centre. But very commonly the executioner's house stood near gates, and graves for the denied lay beyond walls. Take Nuremberg. There is an executioner's house, now museum, whose existence tells the story in brick. The Scharfrichter house sat in a liminal space, facing the city's ramparts and the waste beyond. That house's location is not simply a curiosity for tourists, it is an architectural expression of what municipal law required, a necessary office, regimented and present, yet cordoned off by distance and by custom. In many towns, the executioner's cottage formed a tiny satellite hamlet. His nearest neighbours, often tanners, rope makers, leaders who worked with the city's refuse or with animal carcasses, people who dealt in things the town was unwilling to smell within the ring of its respectable streets. The margin shaped daily ritual. A citizen knocked at his guild hall, and the guildmaster would have a list of men who were eligible to vote. The name of the executioner would not be on it. A case came to court and the magistrate asked for witnesses. The executioner might stand at the back, barred from swearing. His children learned to walk at the city's edge, moving between the gallows and the tannery, watching carts and hearing bells from a distance, but seldom entering the thrift of chapel or market table. Spatial segregation taught manners as surely as any law. Distance itself disciplined social relations. Where the churchyard gate closed on one side, the gallows field opened on the other. It was through these routine movements that the city taught most effectively who was one of its own and who was permitted only to serve its edges. And yet the city's physical map was not a uniform black and white. There were gradations of exclusion and inclusion, and those gradations evolved over time with shifting needs. Opportunities for commerce forced exceptions. Some cities found it sensible to grant the executioner a stall at the periphery, or to allow him to run a tavern that catered to carriage drivers and other passers-by. But even these exceptions were spatially marked. Taverns and stalls hired by executioners were often sited along roads and at gates. The city's geography thus became a ledger that read like law. Dwell in the centre and you are invested with civic honour. Live on the margins and your neighbourhood will forever remind you, and everyone else, of your place. Those margins were written into ritual as well as law. Burials, we have said, were telling. To be denied consecrated ground and to be buried at a crossroads or in a field near the gallows placed the executioner within a ritual geography of exclusion. Sometimes the town found a workaround. A special burial ground for families of executioners, a glade by the gallows where relatives could be laid to rest under the watchful eye of municipal officials. That solution brought its own poison. The family grave located where the gibbet once swung became both a literal and symbolic marker of the family's status. Children visiting their fathers' graves had to walk past the gallows field, past the place where the city's violence had been displayed, and repeat the gesture of separation. The ritual reinforced the statute, and the statute scribed a place in stone. Space also shaped interactions in smaller daily ways. If an executioner's wife wished to be baptized or to attend the parish fair, she often had to submit petitions, to make offerings, to pass under the gaze of parishioners who recognized her name. Her children, if they sought to be apprenticed, would have to find a master willing to accept the social risk. Guild membership could be procured by payment and by shape-shifting, by passing as something else, by taking a trade that was more acceptable. But to do so required money, and that brings us to the third hinge of exclusion: economics. The office of executioner was a precarious livelihood because it was simultaneously indispensable and intermittently rewarded. Municipalities tried different strategies to ensure that someone would accept the office. Sometimes the town paid a salary, sometimes it outsourced the function and relied on market transactions, sometimes it converted the office into a hereditary monopoly, as in France with the Sanson family. The economic arrangements were patched and various, but a few patterns recur with reassuring regularity. Wages were often irregular. Fees and perquisites, those little extras of medieval life, were crucial, and exclusion from the guild economy both limited opportunities and pushed executioners into particular trades. Consider the wage. In some places the town allotted the executioner a modest stipend to ensure he would be available to attend executions, maintain the instruments and keep the gallows in order. In other cases he was paid not a regular salary, but a fee per service, a shilling for hanging, a crown for beheading, a bit for drawing and quartering. These varied by region and by the status of the condemned. The problem was obvious. The city that had few executions in a given year would be stingy with the purses in the local market. The man who depended on the turnover of bodies might find himself poor in years of peace. That kind of instability made the office unattractive and required supplementation. Supplementation came through perquisites. These were legally or customarily permitted extra incomes: the right to take the garments of executed persons, the right, in some towns, to sell the rope or the wood of the gallows after an execution, the right to receive a portion of fines or to hold a monopoly over tanning or the sale of animal carcasses in the outskirts. Some of these perquisites had a legal basis. Others were part of the informal economy of custom. They were often worth more across a career than the intermittent salaries alone. The logical result was a family economy. The executioner's household extracted value from a range of tasks linked to death and to the handling of refuse. The uneasy relationship between legal exclusion and economic necessity is nowhere more visible than in the lives of hereditary executioner families. The Sansons of Paris are the best-known example. From the later 17th century into the 19th, the Sanson name is legibly associated with the bourreau's office. Charles-Henri Sanson, 1739–1806, executed King Louis XVI's sentence in 1793. The family's legal relationship with the crown and the city afforded them salaries and privileges, even as it kept them from full social participation. Being the royal executioner meant a secure income in some seasons and a notoriety that could be a curse in others. The family's long tenure shows us the institutional logic at work. Make the office hereditary to assure continuity. Reward it sufficiently to attract a family to accept the moral and social costs, but do not use that reward as recognition of civic equality. Not all executioners could count on family continuity or on a municipal stipend. In England, Jack Ketch, the notorious 17th century hangman, is a reminder that the office could be a precarious, personalised employment. Ketch's name survives in tales of bungled executions and public hatred. His status was one in which the holder was both public servant and private target. At times, the Crown or civic authorities would attempt to regularise the job by offering wages or by licensing. The English sheriff paid the hangman in many cases. Sometimes the hangman contracted with an alderman, but payment by the job left many executioners poor and dependent. If the king or the city wanted them pliant, they could withhold certificates, punish them, or refuse to renew commissions. The exclusion from the guild economy deserves separate attention, because it was not merely financial. It severed the executioner from social networks that produced credit, apprenticeship, and marriage alliances. Craftsmen's guilds regulated training and trade, but they were also social clubs that integrated men into the political life of the town through councils and festivals. To be denied membership was to be denied a host of social securities. Some towns compensated for this gap by granting the executioner monopoly rights in trades that the guilds shunned. In some places he alone could tan hides or take in stray carcasses. That trade created the self-reinforcing association. He became what the law had declared he was, and the law had declared it in part because his work naturally overlapped with those trades. Where this happened, the executioner's poverty was moderated by a steady, if lowly, trade. Where it did not, the office produced generations of people who lived on the ragged edge of subsistence. Economically, the executioner's position was therefore a bristling calculus. He was paid to do a function that the polity required. The polity protected him in certain ways, but it also limited the routes by which he could convert his labour into socially accepted wealth. The law forbade him from joining a guild whose membership would give him bargaining power, and the spatial logic of the city kept him away from the dens of credit and favour. The result was endemic precarity. Executioners could be cheap labourers for a town that wanted punishment carried out but not honoured. When an executioner sought legal redress or civil advantage, he sometimes found the law itself hardened against him. It is a bitter irony. The instrument of the law's coercion was not treated under the law as an equal subject. The Municipal Balancing Act sometimes worked in subtle ways to compensate this precariousness. Grants of exemption from certain taxes, an important economic relief in towns that levied a host of tolls and market dues, were an important form of support. Letters of protection, allowing the executioner to pass unmolested on certain roads or to live in a municipal house, were not cash, but they were tangible benefits. In the city's ledger, these privileges show up as allotments made expressly to secure the public function. But privileges were never the same as dignity. Exemption from tax does not confer invitation to a guild feast. A municipal house is still a house on the margin. The legal and economic system continued to produce a conditional dependence. The executioner in effect traded social acceptance for municipal sustenance. The impact of these economic structures on families cannot be overstated. Children whose fathers were executioners had limited apprenticeship options, limited marriage prospects within respectable circles, and often inherited the office because other social pathways were closed. The result was the formation of executioner dynasties in some places and chronic poverty in others. Where the office became hereditary, families sometimes became wily in managing both the legal and the economic elements of the job. They cultivated relationships with magistrates to ensure a steady stream of appointments. They invested perquisites in property. They intermarried with other marginal occupations to preserve a social web. When no such protections existed, the executioner's family eked out a living on the town's edge. And yet, endurance is not simply a story of limitation. The pragmatic city often needed a reliable officer and knew that to maintain its magistrate's credibility, it had to have a man who would not be tempted to use the office for private enrichment beyond the sanctioned perquisites. To that end, law sometimes created an odd kind of paternalism. The municipal payroll, the legal monopoly over certain trades, the guarantee of residence near the gallows, all these were ways of binding the executioner and his household to the polity's needs. The contract was not generous, but it was durable. For the rulers, the advantage was clear. The town had professionalised the capacity for capital punishment without making the instrument an equal partner in civic life. If one wants to sum the whole process in a single phrase, the medieval town did what towns are very good at. It instrumented moral judgments with administrative tools. It took the moral unease that surrounded killing by proxy, the recognition that someone must kill, but that killing itself is an act the community prefers not to own, and turned that unease into law, into geography, and into economics. The executioner is legible in municipal statute books as a list of exceptions. He is legible in the map as houses by gates and fields with gibbets. He is legible in household account books as income drawn from capricious fees and the sale of unpleasant perquisites. That legibility is the thing that makes him a social outcast in a durable and enforceable way. There is a small and resilient dark humour in the whole arrangement, the sort of irony that medieval townsfolk would have appreciated as bitterly as they enjoyed a coarse ale. The community demanded the spectacle of its own moral exactitude, and when the spectacle was performed, it refused to allow the performer to sit amongst them at table. They would applaud the show and then turn their backs on the man who had made the demonstration of order possible. Law codified that turning away. Space and statute taught it patiently by repetition. The wages and the perquisites sustained the performer, but also bound him to an unsubtle truth. The position's necessities shaped his relations. The town could not trust its agent enough to give him the ordinary benefits of trust. If you walk a medieval town late on a winter evening, you can still almost feel how this worked. Imagine the light of a single lamp at the edge of the market, the smell of hides from a tannery behind a low wall, the silhouette of a narrow house on the road to the gate. The church bells have fallen quiet. In the distance you see the clearing where wood and rope wait. The man who tends that rope will be up at dawn if the sheriff sends for him. He'll be paid if fortune or misfortune of justice makes his office necessary. He'll be compensated if the law deigns, and he'll be excluded from the very community that needs him. This mundane choreography, statute, home, market, burying ground, made the executioner's outcast status not an accidental prejudice, but an organised civic design, and so the benefits and the burdens were inseparable. Governments needed men to carry out sentences, communities loved the sex tale, but to maintain a moral order in which execution was grotesquely necessary, the same communities and governments set up a set of relationships, legal, spatial, economic, that guaranteed the executioner's marginality. Law translated cultural stigma into civic penalties. Space made stigma visible in houses and graves and roads. Economics ensured that the executioner's dependence was both personal and structural. The medieval city arranged itself so that enforcement of justice could be sustained without dissolving the social line between the respectable centre and the necessary abject periphery. At the end of the day, the executioner's story is not only one of violence and ritual. It is an institutional story about how societies maintain the instruments of order and how they mark the people who carry them. By writing exclusion into law, by mapping it onto geography, and by structuring payment so that the job was bearable but never dignified, medieval communities forged a durable class of licensed outcasts. They were created in statutes and rituals, trained by streets and burial plots, and sustained by fees and the grudging generosity of municipal treasuries. And when the lamp goes out and the market is emptied, the hangman's house remains on the margin, a dark bead on the string of municipal life, a necessary node that the polity recognises and refuses to embrace. If you let the imagination move slowly along that margin, listening, you will hear something else besides the silence. You will hear, faintly and repeatedly, the city's own voice telling itself a story. We punish, but we will not be polluted. We require an agent for our violence, but we will not let him be one of us. It is a story told in town ordinances, in canon law glosses, in the placement of houses, in the payment records kept in the municipal chests. The executioner's outcastness is legal furniture. The city builds it not as cruelty but as social necessity, and the result is a moral architecture that keeps the city sane, prosperous, and, for a moment after the execution, insufferably composed. The law, the street, and the market together do what rumour and fear could not do alone. They make the outcast permanent. The story does not end in the Middle Ages. It evolves, shades, and sometimes softens in later centuries. Yet the medieval apparatus, the compact of statutes that codified infamy, the mapping of the executioner to the margins, the uneven economics that paid a man to be both necessary and untouchable, set patterns that echoed into the early modern and modern eras. In those layers of law and place and purse, the medieval town's choices are written permanently as if to reassure future magistrates that the work of disposing of the condemned can be done without dissolving the community's sense of itself. It was in the end a very practical arrangement, a legal sanctuary that doubled as a social exile. A house on the edge that was paid to perform what the city could not publicly claim. The paradox survives because it served the city's purpose and because the law, once written, acquired a persistence stronger than mercy. Outside the city gate, where the road became a throat of ruts and dust and the houses thinned to workshops and gardens and finally to scrub, there was a small house with a gate that never quite closed. Its shutters sagged a little. Its smoke was never as clean as the baker's on the nearer street. Children in the neighbourhood always seemed to find excuses to pass a little more quickly. Inside that house sat the ordinary details of any household. A cradle at the foot of the bed, a kettle on the fire, a table that had been sanded smooth by hands that washed in cold water and set down plates with the care of people who have to make things last. These ordinary things carried a quiet weight. They were the props of an unusual life because the man who came home wore a name the town never spoke without a glance. He brought with him, if not always immediately, the work he had done that morning, the gloves, the hood, the tools, the smell of tar on rope and iron on wood, and with them a bundle of consequences that settled on the family like dust. Marriage was the first accounting the children learned to reconcile. In many towns, the name of the hangman made a dowry shrink before it was offered. A girl born to such a house learned early to read the faces of suitors. There are records, later and earlier, that show how practical this was. In medieval cities and towns from the Rhineland to the Ile-de-France, the daughters of executioners had far fewer matches among the merchants and masters who tended guild halls and parish altars. The daughters who did marry respectably often did so because their father could buy the acceptance, money and property could, for a price, trade away part of a stigma, but more often they married other outsiders or men whose trades brought them into the same twilight of social life. Tanners who worked with hides, knacker families who disposed of carcasses and horses, cobblers with hands perpetually stained. Over generations these choices folded into a plain arithmetic. The office of executioner made a family necessary to the polity, and yet marginal to its social life. The work paid, it was often oddly lucrative for people barred from the guilds, but the price was a kind of inheritance that no one asked for, and the mother taught her children to carry as gently as possible. It is a mistake to imagine every executioner's household as utterly impoverished or uniformly despised. The specifics varied sharply by place and law. In towns where the office was appointed by the council or the lord by the 14th century and later, executioners could receive a stable wage, exemptions from certain taxes, and rights to odd profits, the right to the clothing of the executed, to carcasses of stray animals, the ability to work as a knacker or tanner. In other towns, the office purchased by or entrusted to a family could be a small patrimony. The Saint-Saëns in Paris, whose dynasty of executioners began in the late 17th century and continued into the 19th, showed how the office could both enrich and entangle. Charles-Henri Saint-Saëns, 1839 to 1806, rose to prominence and wealth through an hereditary office that ultimately made his name terrible and famous when he presided over the guillotine that ended Louis XVI on the 20th of January 1703. The family's story is late compared to the medieval origins of the stigma, but it illuminates the arithmetic, rights and revenue on one side, social exile on the other. Even in the medieval period, there were parallels, families who, by running the instruments of sentencing and the ancillary trades that accompanied them, turned ostracism into a stable livelihood. The price of that stability was limited permeability. Sons were trained in the tools of a trade they had often not chosen. Daughters learned to patch a life that few wanted to share. Passing the office from one generation to the next was not only a matter of teaching a skill, it was a social contract. In cities where civic office holding was hereditary or could be bought, the executioner's child could either be apprenticed to a father and succeed him or be allowed to move away to try other work. But that move was hard. Whatever a young man's talent, the name of his father clung like sap. Parish registers and municipal rolls where they survive are full of half-explanations, entries that show a groom's father described as the hangman or executor. The notation itself could close doors in the marriage market and guild halls in opportunities to be a witness for a citizen's petition. At times, municipal law codified the barrier. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, municipal statutes barred executioners and their kin from serving on councils or entering certain guilds. They were, in many senses, essential strangers. The city needed them, but would not let them into the village square at festival time. The penalties extended to rites that anchor a community. Christian ritual, which enacts belonging, sometimes drew clearer lines than secular provisioning. Some towns, following the logic of purity that governed many urban ordinances, restricted the places where people of certain trades might be buried. Tanners and executioners, for example, might be interred in a separate plot. The aim was to keep certain unclean tasks at a distance from the consecrated spaces of the living. This regulation varied wildly. In some parishes, the priest would refuse to give the sacraments, or would insist on last rites only with strict ritual cleanliness if the parishioner had handled the bodies of the executed. A medieval widow could find herself negotiating with a priest for the burial of her husband, explaining how the office had been a service to the city, and how it had come with formal dispensation. An altar full of candles and a payment could sometimes thaw a formal refusal. But the social ledger, the gossip, the sideways glances, the children kept from play, remained stubbornly unpaid. Being the wife or child of a man who applied capital punishment could alter social mapping in subtle but persistent ways. Invitations were rare. Godparenthood, a key network, was often denied. And the public humiliations that could attend the office, raucous abuse on the street, stones thrown at carriage windows, hurt the household even when the family was careful to avoid headline attention. Survival demanded strategy. Some families kept the housework in the background and left the father's uniform, as it were, away from the polite door. They preserved names quietly. Sometimes they changed surnames or borrowed patronymics that made them less easily associated with their work when they left a city for a new jurisdiction. Outsiders who wished to shed association might take up a false name and begin a new life in a village that did not know their history. Others cultivated the opposite approach. They made the most of the legal and economic perquisites of their station, building patronage networks with the town councillors, the sheriff or a local lord, producing a sort of protective cover. A municipal appointment could be as much a contract as a shield. If the town council depended on you and paid you, it had an interest in defending you from the mob. The price of that protection was compliance with civic control. The executioner had to be visible as an arm of authority and invisible as a man. His family learned to keep a low profile, to present the office as a clear service and a piece of municipal order. That service, paradoxically, made the executioner a public person and a private exile all at once. The child who practiced with rope in the backyard learned not only technique but choreography, where to stand, how to hold a blade, how to handle a scaffold. On market mornings, their father might be on a cart in the centre of town, ringing the bell that summoned order as much as punishment. In the evening, he would be back at the gate, washing the leather, counting the day's receipts, listening to the chatter of his children who had learned to mimic the cries of the market, but not to raise real cheer. Apprenticeship was both vocational and social. It inculcated an acceptance of a long, slightly humiliating continuity. The office could be a narrow house of trade, be the part of the polity that deals with death, and die a little in the eyes of the neighbours. This privately contained scorn, however, found its public theatre in the town square on the day the law was enacted. The execution itself was not mere travail. It was a civic performance with choreography as tight as any liturgy. The procession from prison to scaffold, the reading of the sentence aloud by a clerk, the placement of the noose or block, the role of the priest or friar offering final counsel, each was part of a carefully ordered script. In medieval London and in other medieval cities, executions were arranged at the site of maximum visibility, near the main road, on the gallows hill beyond the city walls, or in the marketplace. Tyburn, outside London, had been a place of public hanging since at least the 12th century and remained a site of mass viewership up to the late 18th century. Its tree hung many people at once and attracted crowds from the city's bustling arteries. Smithfield in the same city was the place for those whose crimes or status marked them for more elaborate spectacle. William Wallace, for example, was executed in London in 1305, hanged, drawn and quartered in a punishment intended to mark not only the man's body but the political order he threatened. Rouen, on 30th May 1431, burned Joan of Arc. Her execution in public was both a sentence and a theatrical message designed to deter and display authority. In these moments, the city made itself visible as an arbiter of violence and as a teaching structure. It told its inhabitants with iron clarity what would happen to those who crossed particular lines. The crowd, in turn, was not a passive audience. It was a religious, civic and commercial amphitheatre. A market day delivered farmers, merchants, apprentices and the idle alike. Vendors sold ale and meat and thin warm pies to keep hands and mouths busy. The crowd's mood oscillated, sometimes pious, sometimes boisterous, sometimes venal. People came to learn, they came to judge, and they came to celebrate, in a way the modern mind struggles to pass. Executions were a mode of communal ordering, a rite that said, "We, the living, will keep order. See what becomes of disorder." The message had rhythms. The cleric's prayer asked for confession. The mayor's presence signalled civic imprimatur. The executioner's movement, preparing the block, seating the prisoner in a cart, lifting the axe, provided the visual climax. It was ritual, slow and exact. It was also a punchline for the many vices with which the crowd entertained itself. Jeers, insults, sometimes hurling of refuse at the condemned or at the person in charge. The executioner, in the centre of this choreography, became a lightning rod for popular emotion. He was the instrument by which the city expressed its disapproval. As such, he attracted its scorn. There is a cruel logic here. To keep communal violence legitimate, a society needed to separate the hand that struck from the moral centre of the community. The executioner's role was to hold the burden, the visible, unclean contact with the condemned, so that the city could declare it had not sullied itself in the act. He was absolution's necessary cost. The town, with its mayor and cleric, pronounced judgment. The executioner made it a visible fact. That divide was rehearsed in laws and in custom. The king's or lord's authority was asserted by being seen above the scaffold. The executioner's anonymity, his hood, his put-on invisibility, created a cleft. The death dealer is present for the deed, but absent from honour. The crowd's scorn was thus both a release valve and a ritualising mechanism. They were allowed to mock the person who must do the person's dirty work, because mocking him affirmed that the mockers themselves were not in fact the hangman. Their laughter was an act of social cleansing. The riots and howls that sometimes greeted executioners were not simply vulgarity. Crowd behaviour could be politically charged. After rebellions or insurrections, the spectacle of execution performed a double duty. It punished the perpetrators and demonstrated the restoration of order. After the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, for instance, the government's execution of leaders and their open display in public spaces carried a message. The social hierarchy had been reaffirmed. The executioner executing that message became a public scapegoat and also an indispensable functionary. Crowds sometimes turned on him when they felt the justice was unfair, or when the executioner was thought to hold sway over the leniency of the act. Occasionally records show executioners were attacked or their houses ransacked in the immediate aftermath of particularly divisive executions. The risk was real. A hood was not merely a costume but a necessity. To be recognised too readily could mean more than gossip. It could mean revenge. But the relation was more complicated than simple hatred. There were moments in popular culture that treated the executioner not only as a pariah, but as a comic or even honoured figure within specific rituals. Carnival customs, for instance, sometimes allowed temporary inversions of social order, in which those ordinarily marginal might perform as judges or masters of ceremony. The executioner's mask and tools could, in such contexts, be turned into props for satire. The same person who was shunned on Mondays might be permitted, at a festival, to swagger as if master of the world. These moments of sanctioned license were therapeutic. They allowed a community, for a short while, to confront the taboo and to make the figure of exclusion manageable by transforming him into a symbol that could be laughed at in tempos toward the spring. Such inversions did not erase the underlying stigma, they made it less brittle. All of this publicity hinged on visual markers. The objects the executioner carried were not mere implements, they were emblems, visual shorthand that announced both authority and exclusion. The hood in particular is the emblem that has held the popular imagination. Its purpose was pragmatic, to keep the executioner from being recognised and thus from being at risk of vengeance. It protected him, and perhaps the community, by making the act more impersonal. Yet that very concealment announced identity. If you saw a man in a hood standing on the scaffold, you did not need any other information to know what he was there for. Hoods, as they appear in medieval art and later prints, read as both shield and brand. They allowed anonymity and guaranteed infamy. A hat that concealed the face became a badge. Beyond hoods, the tools themselves performed as insignia. The heavy axe for beheading the commoner, the sword sometimes reserved for noble heads, the rope for hanging, the iron for pinning down. Each instrument was matched to social status, and thus became a public taxonomy. To be seen with that dual weapon was to be recognised as an agent of death, and therefore as someone the ordinary social world would keep its distance from. In some jurisdictions, the executioner's sword, axe, or badge of office had to be presented formally. In others, it was a private piece of equipment handed from father to son at the moment of succession. The ceremonial exchange of a blade or a tool could be as potent as the handing on of any civic office. It signalled continuity and the legal sanction that allowed a community to put a price on death. Material culture matters here in a smaller, more practical sense. The executioner's workshop might be next to the tannery stall, the stable, the knacker's yard. His clothes were stained, his boots wore the mud from the gallows hill. He smelled of tar, of animal fat, of the iron taste of a town that handled death as a necessary business. His tools were weighty, noisy and luminous, an axe that flashed in sun, a rope with new twists, a block of pine black with age. These items made him visible in daily life and made him a figure people avoided at the door of the inn. They carried a moral geography. Close to the instruments of life, grain, coin, marriage, they nevertheless belonged to another hemisphere, one touched by death and by the kinds of contact the church and the guilds preferred to avoid. What the law did, the popular imagination codified. Woodcuts and peas from the late medieval and early modern period turned the executioner into a figure out of the margins, part devil, part necessary evil. Popular drama did not just mock him, it made him a shorthand villain. In the Danse Macabre and immorality plays he stands paired with death, with sins, with the underbelly of society. That iconography fed back into social reality. People who owned the images of the time, themselves the market that consumed these prints and performances, came to read the executioner's costume as a symbol of moral otherness. The badge that might have begun as a legal token became a totem of social exclusion. There were also local rules that tightened this visual shorthand into a form of legal exclusion. Municipal ordinances sometimes prevented executioners' participation in processions, barred them from certain guild festivities, or refused them seats in civic assemblies. These edicts vary by place and year, but the through line is clear. By denying participation in civic ritual, communities reinforced the idea that the executioner's identity lay outside the circle of the respectable. Where guilds and confraternities formed the social arteries of towns, exclusion from them could leave a family isolated. Those who study urban law in the late medieval period find recurring patterns. The office-bearers charged with public violence are both indispensable and sequestered. In short, a badge of office could protect property rights and secure income. It could not, by itself, buy back the intimacy of neighbourhood life. This is why the strategies of coping were so varied and so human. Executioners and their families moved, they bartered, they cultivated patrons, they accepted the company of those who stood at the margins and made a life together. Some sought to buy legitimacy. With wealth and good behaviour, a family could acquire a house in a better quarter, sponsor a chapelite, pay for a pew, and sometimes shift the tone of gossip. Others leaned into the work's other faces, combining the duty with trades like tanning or knackering that were economically complementary. Some recruited wealthy patrons whose interest in order and control made them protective, lords who needed someone who would carry out sentences without flinching, or city councils who wanted a permanent official they could command. There were improvisations too. A widow might remarry into another outside household to dilute the stigma. A son might adopt a craft that required him to be on the town's periphery but offered more sociability. The long-term result was often a kind of parallel social world in which certain trades, executioners, tanners, knackers, interacted. It was not the mainstream, but it was steady. It fed itself, educated its children in its own trades, and learned to make what dignity it could. The historical record is full of quieter resignations. Parish records note a baptism where the godparents are chosen from among those who will accept the child without scruple. Guild rolls show apprenticeships that cluster in a few trades. Court petitions plead for property rights on the basis of service as a municipal official. Written petitions are often the clearest evidence of the balancing act. The family asks for a pension or exemption and cites loyal service, and the council clicks its pen and sometimes grants relief. If the law was rigid in its social exclusions, custom was often flexible. People negotiated, they argued, they paid, and yet, across centuries and across regions, the anatomy of exile repeated itself. The executioner's house near the city gate, the hood on the scaffold, the rant of the crowd, the daughter with a folded dowry watching the street. These images recur because the logic of the social order that made them necessary did not change swiftly. A polity keen to preserve itself needs decisively to mark its boundaries. The executioner marked them physically. The crowd's laughter, the neighbour's avoidance, the town's municipal clauses, these marked them socially. If the executioner's dress made him visible, it also offered him a thin, perverse kind of security. Hoods, badges, tools and offices were both shield and brand. They hid and they declared. An executioner could be anonymous in the legal sense. The person who carried out the act might be protected by statute, the hood and the rope making the act less a personal spectacle and more a civic one. But anonymity never fully worked. Everyone knew the household at the gate. Everyone knew the man whose hands had done the deed. The hood simply turned recognition into rumour and rumour into a story that the town told itself about its own boundaries. At night, the family in the little house learned to negotiate this in small rituals. They kept the hood in a chest away from the cradle. They washed the boots in a backyard so the smell would not follow them into the market. Children were taught to speak of their father as a servant of the law, not as a monster. The father, when he came home, removed the symbols like garments and set them aside like an offering. He ate at the table, listened to the small tales of the day, tucked in his children, and in the small talk of domestic life learnt the softer liturgy of belonging. These were the quiet repairs that a society's formal law could not fashion. A wife's determination to demand a neighbour share bread in times of crop failure. A friend from among other marginal trades who stood at the gate one market morning and whispered word to keep a child's honour. A patron whose debt to the family ran both ways. In the end, the executioner's exile was a social fact woven into law and custom, craft and performance, image and household economy. The spectacle of punishment outside the town walls and the anonymity of the hood inside the town door were two halves of a single human strategy, to enact violence while attempting to keep it, in some symbolic sense, outside the common life. It is a strange, stubborn hum of human governance. A city that wishes to direct violence must also set apart the hand that directs it, and in doing so it creates a permanent object of scorn and compassion that it itself often depends upon. When you fold the map of medieval Europe, you find the same shapes repeated with local variety. In England, on Tyburn Slope or in Smithfield Square, executions affirmed royal law and municipal order in a market glare. In France, the executioner's family in a lane outside Paris lived under the long shadow of a legal office that could be bought and inherited. In the patchwork towns of the Holy Roman Empire, Henker families settled in houses by the gallows and combined their work with tanneries and knackers' yards. In every place the visual codes, hood, axe, rope, badge, were the shorthand of a complicated moral balance. They told the crowd the state does not flinch, and they told the family you carry a public burden and private exile. Yet even under that dictionary of disfavour there were surprises. There were executioners who became quiet pillars within their own marginal networks, people who, though barred from guild halls, were known in the end as men who paid their debts and kept their promises, as husbands who defended their wives from insult, as fathers who taught their children to read and sometimes to write. There were patrons who took in a disgraced family and made them kin. There were days when a city's clerk, after recording a sentence, would bring bread to the executioner's household to honour service done. Those reconciliations are small things, hardly worthy of the revolution, but they were human. So sleep on the thought of a man settling his hood in a chest by the hearth, of a daughter sweeping the threshold and pretending no one ever said anything, of a town that year after year rehearsed the play of law at the gallows and then continued to buy and sell in the market. These moments of small life make up an anatomy of exile that is never purely law or purely ritual. It is a braid of economy and custom, of fear and necessity, of public performance and private repair. The executioner, who alone stands publicly where the law touches the body, teaches a community the hard lesson that to be orderly is to create some eyesores of life. And the family who lives that lesson at close quarters learns to turn tools and hood and a guarded income into a life that keeps going, quietly stubborn, surviving by habits that are themselves an argument against the neatness of exclusion. In the morning, the scaffold will again be set, the cart will go out, the market will swell, and the town will show itself as a polity that can punish. The executioner will take his place in his hood, and the crowd will respond. The cymbals will do their work, the hood will hide and show, the axe will glitter, the rope will swing, and the family at the gate will hold its breath and then continue on with the business of living. It is a pattern that repeats in many towns and over many centuries, a grim choreography softened at the edges by the stubborn human need to belong, to eat, to remember how to be kind in small ways. It is the story of offices passed down like an unwanted inheritance, and of households who learn, with bitter wit and sometimes with small triumphs, how to survive the weight of a role that keeps them indispensable and apart. And so the hood itself becomes a lesson in paradox, a piece of cloth that protects and exposes, that marks and hides. It makes one man anonymous and his family notorious. It is finally only cloth, but the way a people sees the cloth tells us, more than anything else, about the way a people uses violence and then tries to pretend that the use does not stain its table. The executioner's insignia, hood, badge, tool, are the vocabulary of a social grammar that says, we must do this, but we wish it not to be us. The family is the grammar's collateral, learning each day to live in the shadow cast by an act a community refuses to take wholly upon itself. There were women who kept the ropes. They sat by the hearth of a house that smelled of oak bark and boiled hides, fingers plaiting nooses and accounts in the same motion, the same hands that wiped the blood off the cleaver, sometimes also stitching a child's shirt. In the documents that survive from late medieval and early modern towns, the presence of a woman in the executioner's household is an ordinary and yet startling fact. The widow who did not flee when her husband was taken by disease, the daughter who inherited ledgers and keys when the man with the halberd died, the sister who learned how to bargain for a rope as if balancing a ledger were a kind of prayer. These women rarely fit the dramatic image of a hooded hangwoman stepping onto a scaffold and drawing the blade themselves for the crowd's spectacle. The reality was quieter, more domestic, and more dangerous in a different way. They ran businesses, managed the receipts brought in after sentencing, maintained the tannery or the poultry yard that supplemented meagre official pay, hired deputies, and in some cases had to decide in an instant whether a deputy should be called or whether the household must itself provide the hand that performed a sentence. Sometimes they did the deed, sometimes they never held an axe in their palms. Either way, they were spoken of as if they had worn the instrument and the shame together. Across Europe, the legal forms that allowed this to happen were relatively mundane. Offices that were in practice hereditary municipal roles that conserved the right to a cottage near a gallows, the economic necessity that a household filled the gap between the fee for an execution and the fixed costs of rope, gallows upkeep, and tanners' vats. From the 12th century onwards, with the increasing bureaucratization of towns from Florence to Nuremberg to London, many municipal and royal officials treated the executioner's office as a transferable asset. If a town did not appoint a stranger, it often meant that a widow with the youngest child to feed would petition to keep the house and the right to collect the fees that paid for it. Town ledgers and notarial registers in German free cities, in northern Italian communes, and in English boroughs, therefore sometimes record the widow of the Henker, or the Witwe der Boier. Such phrasing is a tiny testament to a persistent practical logic. The office could not be left empty. When the household survived, so did the public function. When it did not, there were delays, awkwardness, and occasionally higher fees for reluctant deputies. Those who study the records, the dusty municipal ledgers of Augsburg and Nuremberg, the notarial logs of Siena and Florence, the quarter sessions and sheriff's accounts of London and York, note that the woman who succeeded to the household often did so because the material needs of the office required continuous oversight. The tannery had to be run, the rope stock must be repaired. The iron hooks and the cart that carried a condemned prisoner from prison to place of execution needed someone to arrange workmen. These logistical tasks are the more prosaic and yet the more essential aspects of the executioner's trade. They were the cords that tied the office to the household, and they were often the very things a widow knew best. She could keep the leather vats from souring. She could negotiate the fee for the axe blade. She could tally the sums collected for the state so that a deputy's pay was handed out, without the embarrassing delay that usually accompanies a sudden death in a small town. There were, however, additional and darker currents in the way such women were perceived. Gendered expectations about female modesty, control, and sexual comportment turned the executioner's household into a locus of rumour. A woman who handled the practicalities of killing, even if she never touched a blade, repeatedly attracted a very old and very biting kind of gossip. Men in taverns and clerks in chancelleries wrote libels that turned into local folklore. The slanders were not subtle. They accused the wife or the widow of being a keeper of houses where condemned men met women in the night. She hath much commerce with prisoners, a 17th century pamphlet might claim, with the same tone as a parish sermon decrying lewdness. The charge was rarely precise, and it was not often brought to court. It was rather a social instrument. To whisper that the executioner's woman slept with criminals was to attach moral filth to a household already judged necessary but loathed. The sexualized slander did the work that formal law seldom did. It barred daughters from marrying into certain circles. It made men hesitate before lending. Not for the Henker's daughter became an idiom in some places, used in marriage negotiations and employment references alike. This sexualized vilification must be set alongside the law's more concrete penalties. Widows who succeeded her to the office could, paradoxically, be both formally recognized and socially excluded. A town might grant her the right to collect fees, while also forbidding her to sit within a certain pew in the church, or exclude her children from guild apprenticeships. In some towns, the household that housed the municipal executioner was located beyond certain civic boundaries precisely so the stench of the tannery would not mingle with the market. The sightline of the scaffold, the hill beyond the wall, the bridge near the city gate, marked an urban geography of impurity. Women who presided over those households were therefore doubly marked, at once agents of the town and its obvious margins. Men who performed executions fared differently in the grammar of stigma. The male Henker was feared. His children might follow him into the office, and were sometimes acknowledged as holders of a precarious hereditary profession. A son would, in many towns, be taken into municipal records as apprentice and heir, in a way that daughters were rarely written as heirs. The son could aspire to some measure of occupational continuity. The daughter could attempt it too by marriage or widowhood, but the social penalties, the insinuations about lust, the jokes at family meals, shaped a different life. Men might be attacked for their crudeness. Women were attacked for their chastity. The insult for a man was often a challenge to his competence. For a woman, it was an attack on her sexual respectability. This duality echoes the wider medieval and early modern world in which women who transgressed gender roles by taking on public coercive work were turned inward on suspicion of corruption. To be a woman without the acceptable mores of domestic purity was to be suspect in a way that men, even notorious ones, rarely had to endure. It is important to recognise that the stigma was not merely symbolic. Archival instances, scattered though they are, show that a woman who ran an executioner's household sometimes found herself officially attacked on the basis of reputation. When town councils considered whether to renew leases or to confirm the hereditary right to the cottage and fees, the testimony of neighbours mattered. A woman could be refused renewal for unchaste behaviour documented in the municipal minutes. In other cases, the suspicion that she maintained improper relations with condemned men translated into legal regulation. Municipal statutes might forbid anyone from entering the executioner's house unannounced, precisely because the house had acquired the aura of danger and immorality. The regulation then fed the stigma. Once a house is officially to be avoided, rumour finds its nest in the avoidance. The geography of exclusion becomes a generator of accusations. In certain notorious episodes, the slander against women associated with the instrument of the law took on a grotesquerie that fed cultural fears. If a city was convulsed by witch hunts, the executioner's household could be dragged into those accusations. The same networks of rumour that had painted a widow as sexually suspect now painted her as consorting with demons. A woman who lived near the gallows, who knew the secret of tongues and knots, who received late-night visitors to arrange payments for funerary services. In the fevered logic of witch accusations, she looked like a woman who knew too much about death. This was not unusual. The logic of misogyny and the logic of social othering converged. They made certain occupations into tinder for the familiar and deadly conflagration. The unevenness of social penalties also reflects the ways in which local communities themselves were organised and governed, which leads us gently out of the household to a wider map. The same office, the executioner, could look very different in Florence, in Nuremberg, in London, in Barcelona. Medieval Europe was a quilt of jurisdictions, and the patches mattered. In northern Italy, the boia sat in a very particular municipal arrangement. City-states like Florence, Siena and Venice developed civic bureaucracies in which certain necessary but distasteful functions could be contracted out or assigned to non-citizens. In Florence, the public executioner was often a public employee whose wages were recorded in the ducal or communal accounts. The office was an instrument of civic authority. It could be professionalized and regulated in a way that downplayed the purely familial transmission seen elsewhere. A boia in an Italian commune might therefore be a man paid directly by the municipality, living in a house owned by the commune, with few children inheriting unless they passed a civic vetting. In many Italian contexts, and notably in Venice, the executioner was an outsider. The Venetian Republic, whose concern for the image of the city was acute, sometimes brought in executioners who were not full citizens and housed them at the fringes, a policy that kept the city's proud heart unmarred by routine reminders of bloodshed. There is also the Italian taste for spectacle. In some cities, executions were made into civic theatre, staged with elaborate ritual choreography. The boia, in such places, was a known functionary, part of an ordered display of justice. This did not mean acceptance. The boia could still be despised. The difference lay in the formality of his role and his distance from ordinary civic life. The German free cities offered a strikingly different pattern. There the Henker often became the centre of a small hereditary caste. Families who held the office for generations, a phenomenon well attested in places like Nuremberg or Augsburg from the 14th into the 17th centuries, accumulated peculiar privileges alongside exclusionary practices. The municipal records show the Henker's right to certain fees, payments for executions, the right to keep stray dogs, sometimes the monopoly on tanning or tearing down condemned houses. He might be allowed to run a piggery precisely because others would not enter such trades. The family's house often lay near the city's edge. The children grew up learning the tools of the trade, in the same way a craftsman's son learned a craft. But the Henker's name might not be listed with Gilman. The municipal records that permitted the shop stood next to statutes that barred the family from certain honours. A German Henker could be an inextricable civic necessity, acknowledged, paid, and nonetheless a social pariah in the way his family dined at another table. The distance here is spatial and ceremonial. The Henker's house at the margin, his voice absent from council debates, his presence allowed only because the law needed a ready hand. In England, the system was, once again, distinctive. The English sheriff and later crown-appointed hangmen operated in a legal culture where royal and local jurisdictions interleaved. Public executions were a spectacle on the roads outside of cities, with Tyburn outside London being the most famous stage. Executioners in England were often employees of the sheriff and were paid per act. The economic logic, a fee for each killing, made the occupation somewhat mercenary. English executioners could be professional, like the notorious Jack Ketch of the later 17th century, or they could be men who had once been condemned themselves and been offered a grisly reprieve in exchange for service. The result was an ambiguous social profile. These men were visible to the crowd, joked about in ballads and pamphlets, satirized in print. They were part of the spectacle, and that visibility produced a different kind of contempt, a comic contempt as much as a fearful one. Jack Ketch entered the popular imagination as a bungler and a brutalist, a stock figure of caricature. That caricature, the hangman as incompetently violent, tells you something about English popular culture's appetite for both mocking and whitening the edges of social horror. Spain and the Iberian Peninsula had their own logic, linked closely to the institutions of the Crown and the Inquisition. The role of the verdugo, or the executioner, was sometimes absorbed into the state's apparatus, particularly during the 16th and 17th centuries as the Spanish monarchy strengthened its central reach. The autos da fe that punctuated Spanish civic life required secular executioners to carry out sentences handed down by inquisitors, and the verdugo thus worked in a nexus between ecclesiastical justice and secular violence. Here too the executioner could be a public official, paid and kept, but the spectacle of the auto da fe and the moral fervour surrounding it added a particular sheen to the role. The verdugo was not merely a civic functionary, but an instrument of a terrifying moral authority. In the discourses of religion and state, he became a figure pointing to the necessity and the terror of sovereign orthodoxy. What explains these differences? Legal centralisation is one major factor. Where a state, royal or communal, had the administrative capacity to standardise appointment and pay, the executioner could become a functionary with fixed rights and duties. Where authority was more dispersed, the office tended to become family-held, with hereditary custom solidifying stigma into private property. Economic structures also matter. In an economy where tanning, butchery or hide work was essential to urban life, the henker might have an economic niche, a way to supplement meagre pay and make his family economically viable. Guild structures shaped acceptance. In guild-dominated cities, entry into the civic economy was policed, and the executioner's family was often barred from many crafts. In less guild-bound communities, economic necessity could outweigh ritual exclusion. Customs and urban geography mattered too. Cities that cared for their image, Venice among them, kept their boia at the margins by design. Cities where public ritual was part of a civic identity, parts of northern Italy, some German towns, found a way to fold execution into spectacle and thus into civic discipline. And then there are local traditions so stubbornly specific that they resist general rules. A custom in a particular English borough might allow the executioner's children to marry into the same class. In another, the family was shunned for generations. These small differences are the texture of medieval and early modern life. The variety of treatment is mirrored in the story culture around the executioner. Chronicles, ballads, plays and folk tales did not merely reflect social attitudes, they shaped them. The chroniclers who recorded siege and council, such as Jean Froissart in the 14th century, wrote of executions as the closing punctuation of events, and in those annals the executioner is often an unremarked functionary, necessary and practical. But elsewhere, especially as print culture grew and the printing press multiplied images, the executioner took on an almost mythic presence. Look at the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1493, where woodcuts show processions, saints, and the scaffold in the same breath. The visual economy of the chronicle, its dense images of cityscapes, of judges, of the public ritual of chastisement, places the henker as a scenic feature of civic life. He is part of the urban vista, a recurring cut of civic reality. But the same images contribute to myth. A repeated figure on a page becomes an emblem. The hooded silhouette in the woodcut is not just a man, it is a sign that invites stories. The ballads and broadsides of the early modern period are perhaps the most revealing in how they constructed the executioner for a wide audience. These were cheap sheets that printed confessions of criminals, last dying speeches, and accounts of public executions. They sold for a penny and were read aloud in taverns. They made the executioner a character in narratives of sin and repentance. In these texts, the executioner might be an instrument of God's wrath, a grotesque intermediary, a comic figure who bungled a hanging, and sometimes all three in the space of a single sheet. The broadside's function in popular culture was twofold. It preserved official narratives of justice, and it invited commentary. People read, laughed, and shivered. They repeated stories, exaggerated them, and handed on the stock caricatures, the incompetent hangman, the corrupt henchman taking bribes, the sad-eyed man who must do his duty. Drama absorbed these images. Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, c. 1604, is instructive here. The play stages the law and its apparatus in a way that makes the mechanics of punishment visible. The provost and his officers appear, managing sentences and executions as part of a bureaucratic world. The executioner is rarely the focus, but his presence is part of the legal choreography. The popular play thereby contributes to a cultural sense of the executioner as the visible arm of abstract justice. Elsewhere on the continent, Spanish Golden Age drama engaged with the verdugo as well, and the figure appeared in comedies and tragedies where the tension between law, mercy, and spectacle was a central theme. The executioner becomes a theatrical shorthand for the state's power to decide life and death. Folk tales and carnival culture used the executioner for darker humour and for inversion. In the medieval and early modern festival calendars, there were moments when normal hierarchies were knowingly reversed. The Feast of Fools and certain carnival practices permitted mockery of officials and sacred offices. In some places, the executioner's garb could be taken up for satirical purposes, in parodying power. A man in an executioner's hood might become a comic figure allowed to cross forbidden lines for a night. Those carnivalesque moments kept the executioner's image alive in popular imagination, but they also preserved the ambivalence. The man in the hood was both feared and lampooned, both necessary and obscene. Repeated motifs in literature and oral tradition helped to harden social attitudes into near archetypes. The hood, an instrument of anonymity and protection in real life, becomes in story a mask of monstrosity. The hood hides identity. It also hides humanity. The halberd becomes not merely a tool but a sceptre of terror. The executioner becomes the liminal servant of justice, a figure who stands at thresholds, between cloister and market, between prison and public space, between legal order and social revulsion. That liminality explains why the figure figures so well in narrative. He is the thin line between the public order and its violations. He is simultaneously its hand and its shame. Literature and rumour also turned the executioner into a convenient repository for all anxieties about abuse of power. If a magistrate is corrupt in some people's eyes, the narrative goes, the executioner is his visible arm, ready to do whatever he is told, his halberd marking collateral moral failure. If the state seems arbitrary, the executioner's role is its emblem. If justice seems slow and venal, images proliferate of the executioner taking bribery to delay a deed. That motif is a useful rhetorical device. It gives the aggrieved a face to blame. The image of the corrupt executioner circulates in pamphlets and satires across Europe. It becomes a stock complaint against the machinery of punishment, and it helps to sustain contempt for the person who, in most towns, simply did his job. Finally, stories about the executioner taught people how to feel. The last dying speeches sold on broadsides, the prints of flayed criminals, the woodcuts in chronicles, these were techniques of moral teaching. They taught that the seeing of death was useful, an occasion for moral lesson about sin and order. The executioner, positioned in that ritual, was therefore both necessary and peripheral. He did not share in the kind of honour afforded to judges, nor the spiritual authority given to clergy. He was the technical end of the moral story. Literature amplified this lesson. It turned the executioner into a cautionary figure and, at the same time, a target of laughter and disgust. In singing about him or printing his image, society rehearsed its own uneasy relationship with the necessity of violence. The practical consequence of these narratives was to sustain social barriers. The more myths about executioners proliferated, that they were sexually deviant, that they were venal, that they were monstrous, the more communities made laws and customs that kept them at the margins. That is how rumour becomes statute over time. When you read municipal ordinances that place the executioner's house at a particular bend of the city wall, you're reading the outcome of stories told over generations about smell, impurity and moral contagion. The map of a city, in that sense, is a biography of its myths, and yet the reality remained stubbornly prosaic. The executioner measured rope, paid a deputy, fed his children, and worried the way any household worries. The widow across the yard balanced the account book and stitched a shirt, and in doing so she kept the wheels of civic justice turning. The public face of the instrument of death, the hood in the woodcut, the halberd in the ballad, concealed the daily necessary logistics, the maintenance of ropes, the preservation of receipts, the negotiation with municipal clerks. Those logistics explain why women so often appear in the records. The office was a household function as much as a public one, and women ran households. Their social fate, however, was shaped by an older grammar of shame that turned domestic competence into social poison. To be efficient at which small grim tasks must be done, to be good at managing the tannery or keeping a ledger for a gallows, was to be suspect. When the lamp is put out and the city quiets, you can almost hear the slow sound of the boot on the scaffold stair, the creak of the halter, the clink of the iron, then a silence used to teach. In the same quiet you can imagine the henker's widow stitching by the hearth, the smell of tannery bark in the air, her hands made rough by the same work that the law needed but could not bear to embrace. The record books bear her name as a marginal line, but the stories are harsher and louder. The ballads and broadsheets, the plays and sermons, the village jesters' songs, Between the logistical realities and the cultural representations is the pattern that made medieval executioners social outcasts, an intersection of necessary public function, legal ambivalence, economic marginality, and cultural storytelling that sowed stigma into social life. In the end, if you listen through the long centuries, you hear a single refrain with many accents. The city needs a hand that can end a life cleanly and in public. The society that uses that hand will erect rules and rituals to keep it efficient. The same society will also spin tales to keep the moral distance. And where those tales are especially cruel, where gendered suspicion meets civic disgust, women in those households pay a price that is not merely symbolic but practical. Their daughters' futures, their reputations, their rights to a pew, an apprenticeship, a respectful death. The executioner's world is thus a prism through which we see the medieval balance between law and shame, a glass that refracts jobs and stories into the lives of ordinary people who learned to work the ropes and to hide the scars of having done what the city could not do without. The rope and the ledger hang together. So too do the rumour and the ordnance. The medieval town, in its slow, complicated way, draws lines. It keeps the people who do its dirtiest work at the edge, and then tells 1,000 stories to justify the distance. They learned after long practice and 1,000 small humiliations that resistance did not always have to be noisy to be effective. Resistance was a long, patient art of paperwork, of petty bargaining, of bargaining with the calendar and the conscience of magistrates who preferred their sentence pronounced and their authority maintained without having to think about the hands that made that sentence real. The medieval executioner rarely flung himself theatrically against his fate. Instead, he wrote petitions, cultivated patrons, traded in the very tools of his infamy, and staged, in miniature, a social rebranding. Petitions were basic. The executioner's life was defined by discontinuities, between market and margin, between law and ritual impurity, and petitions sought to stitch those seams together. In town halls across France, the Low Countries, the German lands, and the English boroughs, one finds, beginning in the later Middle Ages, short requests, pay arrears, a house near the city wall, permission to tan hides in a certain yard, exemption from a toll, or the grant of a stall in the market. These were not grand constitutional claims. They were the modest liturgies of survival. A request might read as a demand and look like a prayer. The executioner asked to be paid so he might feed his children. He asked for a parcel of land so he might have shelter that would not be confiscated by a creditor. He asked for the license to skin an animal because the knife he used for heads and necks was the same knife that could make a living. The tactic was pragmatic and bureaucratic. If manors and neighbours would not offer a respite, the town might be compelled by ledger and charter to offer the legal approximations of it. Sometimes the petitions worked because they appealed to municipal self-interest. Townspeople liked order. Cities liked visible enforcement. Their merchants desired markets free from brigands, and their magistrates wished their sentences to be enacted so that the law's failure would not be auctioned off to private violence. A mayor who delayed the hangman's pay risked being mocked and, more immediately, risked the failure of justice to be carried out, which could devolve into riot. So cities granted salaries, prebends, and houses in return for reliable service. Cologne's Scharfrichter, often listed in council account books by the 14th and 15th centuries, appears as a municipal appointee with specific fees for scourging, for beheading, and for the burial of criminals' remains, tasks the city was unwilling to let slip into itinerant hands. In Paris, the provosts maintained a small retinue of officers for the haute justice, and the city's accounts reveal regular payments to those who executed sentences at Montfaucon, the great hillside gallows outside the capital where the bodies were displayed against the skyline as both a warning and a spectacle. In English boroughs, the ward motes and council rolls record the simple clause, paid to the common hangman for services. Pay did not equal a meal at the mayor's table, but it bought practical things, license to stay where you were, a roof not subject to immediate eviction, and sometimes a derived right to make money from related trades. Alliances with authority were another steady strategy. Executioners cultivated the magistrate who would sign their clearance papers, the sheriff who would ensure their itinerancy did not land them in an especially hostile parish, the chaplain who would not refuse Christian burial to the family. Sometimes the alliance was institutional. A hangman might become the juryman's servant, the alderman's tool, the city's man. Being formally an official conferred immunities. the right to be present in courts, travel within guarded precincts, or to claim a share of confiscated goods. The trade-off was clear. The city gained control over violence, the executioner gained protection but surrendered independence. Cities turned the executioner's work into a municipal function, and this municipalisation often offered a fragile respectability. Where the Crown intervened, as in royal justice zones, the benefits could be greater. The late medieval borough of Paris, especially as the French monarchy centralised, was sometimes named in royal or provost registers, their salaries established by letters patent. Attachment to the royal apparatus insulated them from the local malice that otherwise fed the stigma. The most inventive forms of accommodation were economic. The executioner's tools overlapped with other trades. Bone, skin, blood, blades. Butchery was the obvious twin. Not by accident do we find executioners recorded as butchers or holding rights to slaughter, an ugly but practical fit. Where butchers could be respected guild members, executioners often could not enter the same doors, but they could practice the art on the edge of the market. In German-speaking towns, the Scharfrichter frequently doubled as knacker or tanner. The knackery was a place for the discarded, and both human and animal refuse had similar commercial and symbolic value. Hides needed curing, meat needed cutting. The anatomy of the condemned and the beast shared the same professional competence. For some cities, the logic was explicit. Give the executioner the monopoly on knacker's work, and you receive reliable disposal of carcasses and an ensured revenue stream for an otherwise marginal official. For the executioner, it was an economic alchemy. Turn disgrace into leather, turn blood into coin. Diversification sometimes included crafts far from the gallows. Executioners learned to sit astride the economic friction of town life. They acted as tanners, undertakers, gravediggers. They sold cord and rope used in executions. They worked as porters on market days. Their children apprenticed, when possible, into trades that would tolerate association with blood. And in those rare families where the office was hereditary, competence at the trade could create a small dynasty. The son who understood the angle of a neck or the weight of a block could step in where others would not. Heredity offered the municipality a tidy predictability, and it offered the family a narrowly achievable form of social capital. Piety and charity were quieter, but frequently practiced strategies. A man who made a living by ending lives learned to be conspicuously religious. The earliest records of executioners' bequests are often pious in tone. They endow a mass for the soul of the executed. They pay for candles in the parish church. They leave small sums to the hospital. Confraternities, lay religious brotherhoods that knitted townspeople together, could be a means of insertion. If a hangman could gain membership in a confraternity, his name would appear in a roll, not in the criminal list. These were not mere reputational exercises. Confraternities provided mutual aid, burial rites, and the soft currency of social connection. An executioner who donated for a chantry or who paid for a light in the chapel could, in death as in life, insist on Christian rights that might otherwise be denied. That was a form of social insurance. Charitable acts could also be practical acts of damage control. A donation to mend a bridge or to feed the poor could be a civic performance. Look at me, the man you revile, doing public good. In some provincial towns, the executioner was the visible face of relief in plague-stricken seasons because his expertise with the dead and the removal and burial of bodies made him useful. Utility stains stigma, if only slightly. There are municipal chronicle notes from the 14th and 15th centuries that quietly acknowledge the executioner's aid in clearing a street after pestilence. These mentions are the historiographical crumbs that reveal accommodation by necessity. Yet all of these strategies had limits. The rituals of social exclusion were durable because they were bound up in theology, law, and the lived psychology of shame. Christian doctrine did not give the executioner an easy place. Killing could be an instrument of justice, the church allowed it, but it remained morally fraught. The blood on the hands of those who condemned and those who cut sometimes received different readings, yet staining remained. The medieval understanding of ritual impurity, itself a complex weave of Christian, Roman and local customs, made proximity to dead flesh a persistent taint. Legal doctrine sometimes formalized exclusion, burial in unconsecrated ground, restrictions on communion, bans from certain fraternities or guilds. These were not mere social slaps, They were the sort of structural rules that made upward mobility difficult. Stigma reproduced itself in ordinary daily practices. Children's games, street gossip, parish windings, and market jokes all kept the scaffold man at a remove. In a society where honour was a visible currency, shown by seating at feasts, by the ability to swear oaths binding in court, by the acceptance of marriage proposals, the executioner often occupied the exact place that the rest of the town could not risk. If a magistrate granted a pay raise to the hangman, the neighbours still might refuse to share a table. Sometimes the small victories of petition and privilege were offset by the municipal decisions that regularised ostracism. Designated houses outside the walls, separate cemeteries, legal limitations on property transactions. Even where the executioner was protected by office, the psychological distance persisted. Respectability in its fullest social meaning required not only legal acceptance, but also the softer currencies of friendship, kinship, and communal belonging. On those accounts, most accommodation remained limited. The executioner could be paid, sheltered, ennobled in a narrow sense by letters of appointment. He was rarely welcomed into the intimate rituals of village life. And yet life continued. The executioner petitioned, the council deliberated, the town kept its markets open. Small human acts of accommodation, grudging or sincere, sometimes stitched a measure of normality into the seams of what remained a publicly strange vocation. If we walk then into the municipal records and the streets themselves, three cities offer a close view of the variability of these practices. Paris, Cologne, and an English borough like York, where the gallows looked out across a flat expanse called Knavesmire, and where civic records permit a slow reconstruction of ordinary life. In Paris, the geography of execution was itself a kind of exile. Montfaucon, a ridge to the northeast, was chosen because it allowed the city to display its penal order without allowing the spectacle to sit within the parish life of the capital. For centuries, the Montfaucon Hill was both a stage and a neighbourhood. The executioner of Paris was sometimes in municipal lists a recognisable figure, a removable name against warrants and payrolls. He lived on the edge of the city, often in a house close enough to be of immediate service but distant enough to be kept from the daily fold of the city's parishes. These houses had small courtyards for ropes and blocks, storage for straw and lime for the disposal of bodies, and, if the surname allowed, an attempt at a garden that could be guarded by walls and held to practical use. The executioner's family in Paris might petition the provosts for a right of burial in a chapel, but often had to wait, begging the parish to accept the dead for reasons of charity. Paperwork shows the municipal side, arrears of pay submitted to the provost, occasional verses of complaint about the cost of an execution's trappings, authorization to collect fees on certain occasions. The parish side offers a different intimacy. Neighbours who ran a market stall refused a relationship but still exchanged bread at festivals. The executioner's child might be baptised under a priest's hand who never let slip an open condemnation in the font. The executioner of Paris sometimes became a small heritable office. That continuity was part shelter and part chain. It allowed families to accumulate a modest store of property, but also trap them in an identity. A son inherited not only an axe, but a social category. There are records, modest and not grand, that show guild disputes. The executioner's attempt to get market privileges across a year or two, a municipal judgment permitting his house to be taxed differently, a demand for exemption from a guild fine. The victories were partial. The Montfaucon address gave security and shame simultaneously. Residence near the city's display of punishment was both a livelihood and a public censure. Cologne presents a different pattern where international trade and municipal authority braided together. The Scharfrichter of Cologne occupies a household nearer the gates, a figure named in the council's account books, sometimes the focus of civic consternation when revenues lagged. The city's thriving trade and compact guild culture meant that entry into a respectable craft was regulated tightly. The Scharfrichter's place in the urban economy grew from a different logic. The proximity of slaughterhouses and tanneries meant that the skills for dismembering humans were not categorically apart from those used in processing animals. The municipal council, conscious of hygiene and order, often permitted the Scharfrichter certain monopolies. The right to skin butchered animals falling under the knacker's fee, or the right to an inn that provided meat for specific civic needs. When disputes arose with butchers' guilds, they were municipal disputes recorded in council entries. where magistrates had to decide whether the Scharfrichter's rights were a threat to guild regulation or simply a municipal expedient. These compromises granted practical improvement in living conditions, but they also codified separation. The Scharfrichter might be allowed to run a tanning yard yet be prohibited from entering the butcher's hall. He marketed leather, yet his social invitations rarely ranged beyond his immediate circle. The English borough of York gives us, in its municipal roles and in topography, the clearest sense of everyday negotiation. Knavesmire, the wide common to York's south, was not merely a site for hanging, it was also a space of contestation over rights and ritual. The York hangman, often described in civic entries as the common hangman, was on the payroll but was also a liminal neighbour. He occupied a small house near the common, a hut that might double as storage for ropes and tar. Payment by the city was intermittent. Arrears appear in the council books like small wounds. He negotiated leases with aldermen, asked for chartered permits to operate a knackery, and fought in chancery for the right to sell cured hides. Some of these litigations had striking human detail. A widow's plea to be granted freedom from a fee because her husband, the former hangman, left debts. A mayor's note that a hangman had been assaulted by an angry family after a particularly disruptive execution. The living arrangements were practical. The hangman's house was near enough to the gallows to be present before sunrise on an execution day, but far enough from the parish boundary that church life could be selectively denied or afforded. The family trajectories in these cities were instructive in their mixture of fatalism and ingenuity. Where a family could hold the office through inheritance, where municipal authorities found that continuity favoured orderly administration, a certain bureaucratic peace emerged. The family could negotiate a routine, a steady wage, a house, perhaps a small market stall. In other cases, the office was a temporary employment for men who turned to the knackery and tanner's bench to make their living more diversified. The children of the executioner had choices that were narrower than their neighbours, but not wholly closed. Some daughters married into trades that could accommodate a touch of stain. Grain millers who worked in a different realm of the market, but who benefited from the knackery's leather. Tanners who were used to marginal association. Porters working the river who were paid for their muscle, not their reputation. On rare occasions, the executioner or his progeny was celebrated in stories or feared by reputation to the point where the name itself became a local curse or a local marker of respect for competence. But these were exceptions. Occasionally, after long years of service and political change, an executioner's career ended in something close to rehabilitation. In some cases, municipal judges, tired of the petty antagonism of neighbours, chose to reroute the stigma into a formal honour, a letter of privilege, a grant to a guild, a public commendation for fidelity to office. Such acts were pragmatic. Reward loyalty, prevent the vacancy of an office that was hard to fill, and reduce the risk that the execution of justice would become a business for criminals. These episodes were not dramatic reversals. They were administrative acts. They gave the executioner legal breathing room without dissolving the broader social taint. As the Middle Ages slid into early modernity, the slow processes that had allowed modest palliation of stigma accelerated in some places and hardened in others. The rise of central states drew penal administration toward the throne. Kings and their bureaucracies preferred regularity. They wished punishment to be a tool of statecraft, and that required officials who could be relied upon, trained, and, crucially, held accountable. The executioner's role, so long local, became sometimes a state office. In France, this process produced one of the most famous families to link medieval marginality to modern bureaucracy, the Sansons. Their family name becomes clearer in the historical record in the later 17th and 18th centuries. A succession of Sansons served as bourreaux of Paris, culminating in Charles-Henri Sanson, 1739 to 1806, who presided over executions during the Revolution and became a figure whose professional competence and personal torment were both well recorded and widely discussed. The Sanson family presents a paradox of institutional normalization and social seclusion. Their official status and steady salary made them municipal servants of the crown, yet their notoriety, enhanced by the guillotine's theatricality, intensified the cultural weight they carried. The state made them indispensable. Society continued in many ways to push them to the edge. England followed a different rhythm, but with similar pressures towards the centralisation. The figure of Jack Ketch, a name that would become proverbial in the 17th century, shows the transformation of the hangman into a public character. The notoriety of the English hangman was such that his mishandling of a beheading or his conspicuous cruelty could become a political scandal. The Crown's need for reliable enforcement elevated the hangman's public function, while public scorn hardened into caricature. By the early modern period, the executioner was frequently a salaried agent of the sheriff, a man whose daily life was regulated, who received instructions and wages, and who sometimes received small pensions. Formalisation reduced the insecurity of the job, but it did not unclench the social fist of stigma. The modern cultural memory of the medieval executioner is a testament to how stubborn images can be. Even as states professionalised the task, literature and folklore reworked the figure into an archetype. In the 19th century, the executioner appears in novels and commentaries as an emblem of a state's moral contradictions. Victor Hugo's scathing meditations on capital punishment, the popular prints that caricatured the masked figure with the broad axe or the black hood, the satirical ballads that made the hangman both villain and object of pity. Legal reformers used the executioner as a totem in their campaigns. The professionalisation and anonymisation of executioners in modern penal systems were presented as a solution to medieval grotesquerie, but they also displaced public disgust. Anonymity became a legal technology of moral distancing. Modern states often adopt rules to conceal the identities of those who carry out capital sentences, not only to protect them, but to shield the polity from the act of seeing its own violence. Where the medieval executioner had been visible and reviled, the modern executioner could be invisible and regulated. The metamorphosis is not, of course, total. The executioner's image survives in popular culture as a darkly comical or morally evocative figure. The hooded man of black-clad nightmares, the ceremonial executioner in stage plays, the caricature in political cartoons. This persistence matters because it signals how societies remember the moral ambivalence at their core. Medieval towns could not, and did not, simply pretend they had no need of force. They invoked law, ritual, and religion to justify the public removal of life. They nevertheless sought, by ritual means and social rules, to distance themselves from the man who made those removals. This is a tension we recognise today. A polity requires agents to do things that individual citizens might not feel they can do, and it then struggles to incorporate those agents into the moral economy of the community. In the broader sweep from medieval to modern, the executioner's story is a lesson in the uneasy bargain between necessity and esteem. Where necessity demanded the removal of life for order, communities paid, sheltered, and in some cases protected those who removed it. Where esteem required ritual purity and social honour, communities constructed boundaries of exclusion that kept the executioner on the margins. These strategies of resistance and accommodation, petitions, alliances with authority, acts of piety, economic diversification, were all attempts to convert the executioner's indispensable function into a life that could also be lived. Their partial success depended on the institutions that surrounded them: municipal granaries, guild certificates, royal letters, and parish registers. Where those institutions were willing to supply legal anchors, the hangman's family could secure housing, wages, and sometimes heirs' rights to the office. Where they were unwilling, the executioner remained a citizen whose social life was forever hemmed. What endures in memory is not institutional nuance, but image. The medieval image of the executioner as outcast has an aesthetic longevity that modern law cannot neatly erase. It haunts our plays, our novels, and our private imaginations because it brings us face to face with a moral problem we continue to deflect. Someone must commit sanctioned violence for society to persist, and the person who does so is both necessary and shameful. The medieval solution, to keep the executioner near enough to serve but always at arm's length in honour, is one we recognise in modern mechanisms that anonymise the executioner's face mère, outsource the act of killing to specialists, and place the moral burden on law and not on individual actors. So the executioner's story is, in the end, a human one. It is about men and women who learned the craft of an ugly competence and then learned the craft of living with the consequences,